welcome to Sectors Up Close. I'm Elena Casas. Our focus today is on food prices and my guest is Libin, Zhou, Agriculture Research Manager at Refinitiv. The war in Ukraine has sparked serious concerns about global food prices. According to Refinitiv's own research, Russia and Ukraine account for 30% of world wheat exports, 19% of corn exports, and, wait for it, 80% of world exports of sunflower oil. The conflict has closed all Ukrainian seaports and exports, although some Russian ports in the Black Sea are still operating. The effect on food prices was immediate, and while the price of wheat has come down since spiking in early March, it's still up around 45% this year. The crisis has also created a domino effect across the sector, driving up the prices of other foodstuffs such as rice, as well as animal feed and fertiliser. A shortage of gas and surging energy prices have even affected the greenhouse production of cucumbers. The United Nations last week said world food prices rose 13% in March to a new record high, while the Food and Agriculture Organization was warned food and feed prices could rise by up to 20%. Well, for more on this, I'm now joined by Refinitiv's Libin Zhou. Libin, hello. Which countries are suffering the worst impact from this, and how can they replace the supplies that they're no longer receiving from Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, I would say most of countries who import lots of grains and oilseeds from the international markets are directly or indirectly affected by the Ukraine crisis. As you mentioned, Ukraine is playing an increasing role in the global grains and oilseeds exports. Middle East and Africa countries are the major importers of Ukrainian grains and oilseeds. China is one of the major buyers of Ukrainian corn. India, Spain are the top Ukrainian sunflower oil importers. All these countries are directly affected by the block of Ukrainian exports. So you can see the block of Ukrainian exports just tightened the global supplies, but demand is still there. So the prices for this grain and oilseeds just went to near or record high levels.
Have global markets priced in losing the crop from Russia and Ukraine this year, or could the prices move still higher?
Yeah, that's not easy to answer. Based on our analysis, Ukraine just current tight supplies are primarily due to the block of Ukrainian Black Sea ports. Ukrainian still has high inventories of grain and oilseed in stock for exports, but the global market doesn't have access to them. So if this is one problem. So for current season supply, most importantly, the war is affecting the spring planting in Ukraine. Like the area and the production losses associated with the war could affect supplies not only for current season, but also for the upcoming season. So if production losses in Ukraine are larger than the market expectations, then I would expect the prices for these grains and oilseed could go even further.
Do you mean then that even if the war ends soon, it could take a long time to get Ukrainian production back into global markets and for the prices to stabilise?
I would talk about it in the short term and in the long term. Last year, Ukraine harvested a record amount of corn and wheat. So based on our trade flow data, Ukraine just shipped a huge amount of corn, wheat, and other agricultural products to the international market. But Ukraine still has at least 4 to 5 million tons of wheat and over 10 million tons of corn and other agricultural products in stock for export. So if the war winds down and the Ukrainian Black Sea ports reopen, the Ukrainian exports could temporarily elevate the current tight supply in the global market. Price could go down in the short term, but as I mentioned, the war is affecting the Ukrainian spring plantings. We estimate over 40% of Ukrainian corn planted area losses this season. And the winter crops in Ukraine its harvested area and the yield potential could be reduced by the development of the war. So from this perspective, the production losses this summer and this fall in Ukraine could affect the global supplies for the upcoming marketing year 2022-23. So I would expect it will take at least a couple of seasons to rebalance global green and oilseed supply and demand.
Thanks so much for that, Libin Zhou, Agriculture Research Manager at Refinitiv. Well, before I go, here are some of the top stories we're following in this space. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the UN World Food Programme and the World Trade Organization have called for urgent coordinated action on food security and appealed to countries to avoid banning food or fertiliser exports. In a joint statement, the leaders of the four institutions warned the Ukraine war was adding to existing pressures from the COVID-19 crisis, climate change and conflict elsewhere, threatening millions of people worldwide. They said sharply higher prices pose the greatest threat to the poorest countries, but vulnerability was also increasing rapidly in middle-income countries, which host the majority of the world's poor. Severe outbreaks of bird flu in the United States and France are tightening global egg supplies and raising prices of the food staple as the war in Ukraine disrupts shipments to Europe and the Middle East. Bird flu has wiped out 6% of the US flock and 8% in France, which is Europe's largest producer. That has resulted in a 200% increase in wholesale prices in the US and a 69% increase in France. Ukraine, meanwhile, produced 14.1 billion eggs in 2021 and was a major supplier to Europe and the Middle East. Producers say prices are likely to remain high, eating into the profits of bakeries and food companies already struggling with higher prices for flour and other goods. Sri Lankans waited in queues to buy essentials ahead of the Sinhala and Tamil New Year as the country faces shortages of petrol, diesel and cooking gas and soaring prices for food products. In the capital, Colombo, hundreds of vehicles stood in nearly mile-long queues as they waited to get fuel, while residents stood in long lines holding plastic containers to get kerosene used as cooking fuel. The island nation of 22 million people is in the throes of its worst financial crisis since independence in 1948, with a foreign currency shortage stalling imports of fuel and medicines and bringing hours of power cuts a day. And that's your roundup of food prices. I'm Elena Casas, and this is Reuters.